Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. This is our second What's Happening in Washington webinar for 2026. My name is Aditya Girish. I'm the Government Affairs Manager and Biosciences Director here at GG Consulting. We're a government affairs firm based in DC. I'm joined here by my GG colleague, Chris Cooper, as well as Chris Oates, the founder of Legislata. We'll start with introductions in case you're new to this whole series, but then we'll dive into politics and policy that we're all tracking. And a particular emphasis in this session is on the healthcare and life sciences and related activities, particularly at the Department of Health and Human Services and the impacts on the wider community. So I'll just briefly go. My background, I've been with G2G 4 years now. I'm actually not a former government staffer. I'm actually a trained scientist. I have a PhD in biomedical engineering from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, where G2G has a large footprint. And I actually started working part-time at G2G, tracking funding opportunities for our clients and putting together our monthly government biosciences grants report, which some of you may be familiar with. In my current role, I still manage that process, but directly manage a portfolio of clients that are in the health and medical space in advancing their federal engagement priorities, whether that's in funding or advancing policy. And yeah, I'll turn it over to Chris Cooper, and then we can go from there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Cooper. As Aditya said, I am a director in G2G Consulting's Washington, D.C. office. Prior to joining the team in 2023, I served in a variety of roles on Capitol Hill, working for two Republicans from the state of Ohio, where I was born and raised. Served in every position from the person who welcomes guests into the office up to chief of staff and the person who leads the appropriations work in the office.
And I'm Chris Oates. My background is in political risk consulting and trying to forecast long-term trends about what is going to happen in politics. Right now, I am focused on my own race. I'm running for the state house in Massachusetts. Obviously, a big biotech sector, so that's a big part of my. I'm based basically around Tufts University, and so that is something that my constituents care a lot about. Is what is going on with the biotech world here. They also care a lot about roads and potholes. And if you're interested in anything else about that, I'll leave it here, but focus on what's going on in Washington, not Beacon Hill, for the rest of the hour.
Great. Thank you both. And let's dive in then. So we're at this beginning of June. We're just about 5 months out from a major election. There's a lot on the public's mind on the economy, on cost of living. About a week after we did this webinar back in February, we entered a war in the Middle East. There's been a lot of developments on redistricting. The president's approval has gone down quite a bit below 40, and Congress is also not doing great as well. We've had a lot of contentious primaries with both parties with some interesting results. So I'll ask both of you, what's the state of play at the moment? And what do you think the outcome for control of Congress will be? Do you even think we'll have a clear outcome right after the election? Can you talk about some of the potential scenarios that you're looking out for? Chris Cooper, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, so from my perspective, even though at this point it looks like Republicans are currently winning the redistricting war across the country, I do think it will be extremely difficult for the party to maintain control of the House in the next Congress. Republicans have effectively a two-seat majority right now, so Democrats really only need to flip a net of 3 seats later this year to win control of the chamber. And just to give some historical perspective, on average, I think since the 1930s or so, the party in power tends to lose roughly 25 seats in the midterms. So obviously that's not working in the Republicans' favor here. Democrats, as I think Aditya alluded to, are also leading in sort of generic congressional ballot polls, which, I don't personally think is very surprising with the party in power tending to suffer more than the party that's not during the midterms. I would say I am not expecting, though, there to be any sort of veto-proof majority shift to take shape after the elections, just given how congressional districts have been drawn in both red and blue states across the country. There are typically really only maybe 15 to 20 toss-up seats out of the 435 seats in the House. So, um, even though at this point I would project that the Democrats will likely take control of the chamber, I don't think it will be any sort of massive wave where they're able to overcome presidential vetoes on anything should it reach the president's desk. Um, on the Senate side, even again, in probably a strong Democrat year, I still think Republicans have a good chance of maintaining the majority after the midterms. It's a pretty favorable map for Republicans in 2026. And again, currently in the Senate, Republicans hold 53 seats, and Democrats and independents who are aligned with Democrats currently control 47 seats. And historically, the Senate trends for the president's party are not quite as consistent or clear as they are in the House. So, just as an example, during the midterms of Trump's first term, House Democrats gained, I think it was about 41 seats, and Republicans ended up gaining a net of 2 seats in the Senate. So just because, again, the House might flip in a significant way doesn't necessarily mean the Senate will hold that as well. I'm looking at roughly 3 to 4 toss-up seats, 2 of which are held by Republicans currently, North Carolina and Maine. I would say the North Carolina seat in particular will be a tough seat for Republicans to hold, with the former governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper, on the ballot for Democrats. So as far as what that would mean going into the new Congress, if Democrats take control of one or both chambers of Congress, any new push for budget reconciliation, which is the maneuver that Republicans have used to pass, more party line type legislation this Congress, would be, dead. And major legislation would be harder to pass and enact. I would also say oversight and investigations would expand as Democrats would gain subpoena power. So we'd see more executive branch officials being called to testify before congressional committees, more often. So I think that's what we'd see on the congressional front, and then on the administration front, um, President Trump will rely even more on executive orders and agency rulemaking to push forward his agenda if Democrats take over.
Chris Oates?
Helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think the latest prediction markets had it at 47%, I believe, that Democrats would take both the House and the Senate, and 35% that they would take the House and not the Senate. So overwhelming majority that they will take the House. I think that's correct. I think that Chris Gruber is absolutely right that we have a shamefully small number of actual toss-up seats in the country right now, but there's still enough to give Democrats the majority. The Senate, I think you're right, it comes down to individual candidates a lot more than it does in the House. So for me, I would say that North Carolina is basically overwhelmingly likely to be Democrat right now. Maine is the next bet. I think it's likely to be Democratic. Susan Collins' approval ratings are a lot lower than they were in 2020, and the Democratic advantage is higher than it was. However, Graham Plattner is, in my mind, not a great candidate. And I don't know how he's convinced everyone that he's just a working class oysterman when he actually went to a very elite private school and his oysters get sold to his mom's restaurants. But anyway, that's just my thoughts. But I do think that he's probably going to win, but it is more like a 70-30 probability than an absolute. And then yeah, the Democratic Party is then looking at 4 states where they need 2 of them. Ohio, where they have Sherrod Brown, and he's in a better environment now than he was in 2024. However, does that matter? Because he's no longer the incumbent. Mary Peltola, who is also kind of this quasi-incumbent because she was previously elected statewide to the House. She's going for it. And then also in Iowa, where I believe they're voting today in their primary for their nominee for Democrat. Fun fact, I know one of them because he is married to one of my friend's sisters, Zach Walls. I met him at a wedding once, wasn't impressed, but he might win. He seemed, I don't know, he's probably fine. And then in Texas, there's James Tallarico. And that is going to be a hugely expensive race. And I think what's interesting there is not necessarily that Tallarico will win or lose. We don't, we can't predict that, but that it being a competitive race is going to draw a lot of resources that may have otherwise gone to Iowa or Ohio or North Carolina. So I think that's just something to keep in mind, that if we see Texas sucking up a lot more resources, thinking about where that's not going to and what that would mean. For me, what I'm looking for is, as Chris Cooper said, I think it definitely obviously changes what's going to happen in 2027, but I'm also looking at what might it mean for 2029, because the senators that are elected this cycle will still be in office in 2029. And if Democrats do pick up the majority of, 51 seats or so, then there's the chance that they'll have a trifecta in 2029. So a lot of the policies that they're going to be talking about in 27, it's kind of a difference between, are they doing what Democrats did in 2007 and 8, where they are, as a party, coming together on what their platform is going to be if they win the next election, um, because they think they have a real chance? Or are they thinking we have to have messaging bills that are not necessarily designed to create alignment within us, but to create divisions within the other party to help our candidates in 2028? And so if Democrats do have a majority in both the House and the Senate, I would then see a lot more talk within party officials about, if we win, here's the policy that we want to adapt on this and this and this and this. There's already been kind of a Project 2029 that's been discussed. It's not really fully established yet what that's going to be, but to me, that's what, and from a policy point, that's what I'm looking for. I think if they win, then what you'll see is, November 6th or 7th of this year, Democratic strategists really starting to think, what would we do if we won control of Washington? And then there's going to be a lot more focus on institutional reform, from maybe abolishing the Electoral College to expanding the Supreme Court, and then policy reform of, do they really go for Medicare for all, or do they have something else that would be their signature policy in 2029?
Great insights. Chris Oates, just really quickly, given that you are running, we hear a lot of talk about this generational change, the need for generational change. Is that something you're seeing? Is that something you're hearing in circles? What's your take on that?
It's interesting because it's definitely there. I like, here in Massachusetts, we have a Senate race between Ed Markey, who is 79 years old or 78, and Seth Moulton, who's probably late 40s. And their Markey has been able to neutralize that by really focusing on the ideological divisions that between him and Moulton. And so I think that it is definitely there and latent. It crops up when I think there are not the same, when there's nothing else to divide people. So you see in Maine, it definitely hurt Janet Mills, but she wasn't the same. It wasn't the same kind of race. It was actually flipped, where she was the more moderate candidate to Plattner, who at least portrayed him as progressive. I think what I'm really seeing is just a lot of dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party from Democrats. And definitely, like, when I'm knocking on doors, you talk to a lot of people who say, I voted Democrat um, for years, but they're not doing anything, and I can't vote for Republicans, but I guess I'll vote for Democrats. So that, I think you can see it in the numbers, where the president's approval rating is well below the difference in the generic ballot. And so when you're looking forward to November of this year, do the what is known in some political science terms, the double haters who disapprove both the Republican and the Democratic Party, do they break for Democrats? Because even if you don't want to say you approve of them on a generic ballot, you're still going to vote for their candidates over the Republicans. So that's definitely, I think, there. Um, I mean, personally, I love to see generational change in the Democratic Party and younger candidates winning, given that I'm the youngest in my race. But no, I have not seen it yet as the single most important thing, as perhaps it was early in 2025, when it seemed like that was going to be the next dividing line for the Democratic Party. I don't think there really is one dividing line. I think there's a number of different fragmentations that are happening across the country.
Yeah, that enthusiasm gap you alluded to is certainly something that is, I think, underrated among folks who are just casually observing. But that's enough about elections. Why don't we turn back to appropriations, which is one of our favorite topics. So we're left with just a few months in financial year 26. The financial year ends on the 30th of September. When we last talked about appropriations, we were just at the very start of the process. We didn't have the president's budget out yet. There were some offices that were starting their process. But since then, there have been significant developments on these appropriations bills, particularly in the House, as well as on other, must-pass important legislation like the NDA. Chris Cooper, do you want to talk about where we are with these processes and what the readouts are so far, what we can expect in the next few months? And anything that might interest folks on the call, particularly in the health, life sciences sector, if there's anything.
Sure, I'll kick it off. So the House Appropriations Committee at this point has considered and passed seven of the 12 annual spending bills for the fiscal year 2027 process. The committee is scheduled to pass two additional annual spending bills that cover the Department of the Interior and EPA, as well as the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development tomorrow. So they are making some pretty great progress so far. House Appropriations Committee Chair Tom Cole, a Republican from Oklahoma, outlined an aggressive committee markup schedule in April, where he was aiming to approve all 12 of those spending bills by the end of this month. And at this point, it looks like the committee is positioned to accomplish that. So they are moving. Just to highlight a couple of areas that may be of interest to folks on the call. As far as what we know so far, the House Appropriations Committee has included $7 billion for the National Science Foundation, which is $1.75 billion or roughly 20% below the currently enacted level of funding for NSF. I will point out, though, that that amount is roughly equal to what the House proposed in fiscal year 26. So typically what has been happening is the House will include a little bit more drastic funding cuts for some of these departments and programs more in line with the president's budget request than the Senate. The Senate will come in at a more healthy or higher funding number. And then when they negotiate the final product, as we saw with NSF funding in FY26, it ended up being about $1.75 billion above the amount that the House had proposed. So, in other areas, I guess another one to highlight, the House committee also included 1.3 billion for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, for fiscal year 27, and that is about 548 or $550 million below the enacted level. But again, it's more funding than the committee had recommended last fiscal year. So we'll likely see a similar sort of process take place as the bills continue to move through the process. The Senate Appropriations Committee, which typically moves slower than the House, has not yet passed any of the 12 annual appropriations bills. However, the committee did announce its intention to consider three of the spending bills this week. I believe it's on Thursday. And again, I expect the Senate spending bills to be more bipartisan in the initial drafting of the bills and to not include as drastic spending cuts as the House proposals so far.
Yeah, we're all waiting with bated breath for what the Senate does, as we were last year. Chris Oates, anything to add? And if not, we can move on to other items.
No.
Okay. Next item, which I know is very important to a lot of folks on the call. There's been some significant changes on the SBIR front. Thankfully, we got an SBIR reauthorization about, I think, 2 months ago now. There's been some modifications to how that program is working. And agencies have started to put out money, not all of them. But can you guys talk about that? What should people know about what's in the new SBIR reauth, and what's the status about those funds being dispersed and opportunities being posted? Chris Cooper?
Sure. Yeah. On the reauthorization front, as Aditya just mentioned, both SBIR and STTR programs have been extended through the end of fiscal year 2031. The previous authorization lapsed last September, so September 30th, 2025, which, as again, most of you on the call probably felt the impact. The lapse in authorization did tie up billions of dollars in new research and development R&D funds. The new law does establish limits on the number of applications a small business can submit. There are new national security risk requirements for participants, and there's also a funding set aside for strategic developments in critical technology areas. So, on the application limit front, agencies are empowered to set their own application limits each year, starting in fiscal year 2027. Agencies can waive the limit for proposals that relate to, again, those time-sensitive or urgent solicitations. The law builds on that foreign risk assessment from the previously enacted SBIR extension by requiring agencies administering SBIR and STTR to evaluate whether small business applicants present security risks, and the agencies are able to consult with U.S. intelligence agencies and law enforcement during this process. So, um, you know, making sure that you are thinking of any potential connections to certain foreign entities from countries of concern like China, Iran, North Korea, et cetera, will definitely serve you well as you're going through that process. One new thing that's helpful for small businesses is that the agencies have to notify the applicants that have been denied because of a covered security risk of their findings, and also give the applicant a chance to mitigate those risks. So that is a welcome development. And then finally, federal agencies that participate in SBIR under the new law have to set aside 0.5% of their extramural research budgets for strategic breakthrough awards, which again will be awarded to small businesses conducting research in critical technology areas.
Yeah, that foreign risk stuff was such a headache for so many people, including a lot of companies that we were working with. So I'm glad at least there's some degree of resolution there. Chris Oates, I know you're up in Boston. There's probably a ton of small businesses who are, really worried about where this was all going. Any insights from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one of the things I want to mention that obviously it went through Congress, and that's great, but the actual implementation of it is a big concern because what we saw last year with the National Science Foundation is that there were a lot of universities as well as businesses that weren't getting grants and they just couldn't hear what was going on and worried about the politicization of this. I think it's one of those things that we know what Congress intends for this. Um, but businesses, and I know up here, certainly the wider biotech community is very worried whether that will actually happen or whether what we'll see is similar to last year. The money's supposed to be going out the door, it's not going out the door. No one quite knows why. So that's something where I think, obviously working with a firm like G2G, but also with your local representatives to try to find out if that does happen. And obviously, we don't know it will. Um, have them work with you to try to figure out what's going on and if there's something holding up the process that shouldn't be, or if it's just, there's a lot of money to get out the door and there's obviously delays in approving grants.
Yeah, absolutely. I know NSF and NIH literally just put their SBIR dates out, I think last week, one first deadline in June or July, I think. So it is significantly delayed. And NIH, the first cycle is not the first admission cycle for their overall awards is not till September. So that's, a couple of cycles missed in the year, which is a big, big thing. Um, yeah, and I think another item which also broke last week, just to add on to this discussion, was the new grants policy proposal that was put up by OMB. So that is going to have, if it is implemented in full, it's still a proposed rule, but that's going to have significant impacts on pretty much every entity that's applying for a grant. And we'll put the link in the chat if you're not familiar with it. But at a high level, it sort of codifies a lot of the attempts by the administration to modify the grant disbursement and regulation regime to meet their priorities. So they put out what they're calling uniform grants regulation. So it sort of expands not sort of, it actually does expand the discretionary termination authority for federal awards that are not aligned with agency priorities or what they're calling the national interest. And so again, as they've tried to do before, there's going to be, uh, significant political appointee involvement in how grant decisions are made, ensuring that, again, there's that, alignment with administration priorities and views. In terms of foreign collaborations, they talk about how, how they're trying to limit collaboration with countries of concern, including China. That's a little bit clearer than it has been in previous years. It's not a blanket prohibition, but definitely more stringent. Um, of interest to a lot of folks, particularly who are going to conferences. There's significant restrictions on allowable costs, including conference-related expenses as well as publication-related expenses. As a lapsed scientist myself, I know how important conferences and publications are to the community. So that's going to be a big hit for a lot of folks. And of course, a lot of other measures that we've heard of before, anti-DEI policies, as well as stronger enforcement of immigration-related provisions like E-Verify. So really, really big ticket item. It was just released last Friday, and so comment period is still open until not January, July 13th. So if folks want to make their thoughts known, and I assume a lot of folks will, I would strongly recommend you take a look at it, and I'll definitely put it in the chat. Um, Now, on that vein, Chris Oates, again, given that you're in Boston, any thoughts on, what folks in Boston are saying about this, given, the outsized impact of the life sciences sector there?
Yeah, I mean, they're very concerned about it. There's a big concern that, and this actually connects to a story we heard this past week as well, that Mark Wayne Mullen, the Secretary of Homeland Security, might try to stop flights that are going into blue cities, what he calls sanctuary cities. And it's one of that, the airline story is one of those that it's such a dumb idea, stopping international flights going into New York and Philadelphia and Dulles, that you can't imagine it would actually happen. And so folks in the life sciences are saying, well, if they're willing to do that to air travel after the World Cup, what would they be willing to do for life science technology, especially if there are folks in the administration who think that Boston is not an acceptable location, but North Carolina with a big biotech sector, Indianapolis with Eli Lilly there might be. And so, yeah, there's definitely worries. I've heard people saying, what can the state do to step in and provide research funding for that? And the state can't really do much. And I think this is an issue you're probably going to be hearing about many states. Maybe California would have the budget to help backfill some of that gap. Massachusetts has tried a little bit. I'm sure New York might try, but the amount of money coming from the federal government to these sorts of programs are just more than what any one state can have. And so there is a lot of concern, and there's not much that anyone can do about it. So we are, other than hoping that our federal delegation can do something, but again, there's not a lot of hope that the federal delegation has any influence in the administration. So it is, yeah, a lot of worries and not much that we think we can do about it, unfortunately.
Well, on that very, very happy note, Let's maybe talk about some other agencies very quickly. I know we mentioned NSF at a very high level. I think there's a couple others, maybe ARPA-H. Any thoughts on what's going on there? Both the Chris's?
I guess on the NSF front, one thing that I'm tracking in April, the Trump administration removed all members of what's called the National Science Board, which is basically the group that advises the president and Congress on, science and engineering policy. They help review and approve the NSF budget proposal for the fiscal year, programs and awards as well, and, really help steer NSF's trajectory. So that was a big move that has received a lot of attention. The White House has since tried to justify the move by pointing to a court ruling that limits the power of federal officials who are not appointed by the U.S. Senate. And the National Science Board members do fall into that category as they are not approved by the Senate. But I guess past board members now have countered that perspective and have emphasized that the board's positions are recommendations and are not, considered orders. So, since that decision was made, we've seen House and Senate Democrats in, top committee positions in particular blasting the move and saying that the removal of all board members will undermine U.S. interests in science and technology as we're, looking to outcompete other countries, again, like China and our other, near peers in these areas. And, as far as ability to get grant dollars and money out the door, um, it's hard to see how the move would help NSF get that money out the door faster. So that is something we're tracking.
Yeah, that came out of nowhere, I think. But yeah, as you say, it's going to be very difficult on the folks who are still at NSF trying to, wade through all of those decision-making capabilities. Chris Oates, anything to add?
Well, just on ARPA-H, I think we're kind of in a no news is good news moment because they still seem to be working and they still seem to be putting out reports and announcing investments. So it seems as if ARPA-H, I mean, I don't want to jinx it, but has not been too affected by political upheaval. So at least in the last year or so.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Liz on our team actually met the director about a week or so back. So I think she shared that sentiment. They're trying to put out programs, as quickly as possible. I think there's some stuff that's, tied more to the administration's priorities. There's a microplastics program, which I thought was pretty interesting. And even like a larger system-wide program to improve how science is even conducted, which, as a former scientist, again, I think is kind of needed. So yeah, they definitely have a little bit more flexibility, and I think they're still hiring program managers at a steady rate. So yeah, if I was someone interested in federal funding, ARPA-H is probably where I would take a look at. Um, all right, let's go to another hot topic, healthcare and AI. Are you guys looking at anything, in that space, any federal policy or initiatives, in that space? I know there's so much noise there, but I was wondering if anything caught your eye.
Well, I know that the so AI and wearables is a big topic. I think there are different tiers in the way I view it of kind of AI in healthcare products. There are the kind of very easy to implement if you get the regulations right. So, for example, AI note taking that doctors use, you have to get them correct and make them HIPAA compliant, but it's relatively easy to implement. Then there are the ones that on the other end of the spectrum are like AI-enabled chatbots to help people diagnose themselves, which I know there's quite a bit of concern from members of Congress and advocates that a hallucination in that is much more consequential than just a note that the doctor's going to see anyway. And then you have kind of in the middle things like wearables, where medical devices that include AI is um, something that I think the FDA could or could not approve, and they could or could not take a different approach to it. So currently, it does seem as if they are trying to take a bit of a more permissive approach to these wearables, but that is, of course, going to differ item by item. So I would say that until we see some real efforts by Congress to try to codify this, it will be important to look to the agencies to see almost like what's their case law and what are the precedents they're setting about what they're approving and not approving.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris Cooper, you have any thoughts on the congressional side that Chris Oates just alluded to?
Yeah, from what I'm seeing, again, related to appropriations bills that have been released in the House so far, there is language, um, recognizing that emerging AI tools have the, for instance, potential to improve the efficiency and consistency of FDA regulatory review processes, for instance. So the House Appropriations Committee um, has encouraged FDA to evaluate almost the appropriate uses of AI to enhance data analysis and again support timely review of applications. The committee also included some language supporting steps that FDA has taken to identify and oversee issues relating to AI in drug development and urging the FDA commissioner to formalize a dedicated cross-center team of experts in AI-enabled drug development. So Congress is definitely um, leaning into AI and health and the overlap there. There's also some standalone legislative proposals that have been introduced in Congress this session. There's a bill called the Health AI Act, which hasn't really gotten much traction, but the purpose of the bill would be to direct HHS to establish a grant program to facilitate research regarding the use of generative AI in healthcare. So there are different proposals that are out there, most of which have not received any sort of real traction. They might have a couple co-sponsors, but no, scheduled committee consideration or any um, hint that the either chamber will vote on them anytime soon.
Yeah. Always interesting to look at that, what Congress is doing. I know I'm also tracking potential package that I think two members are working on. Details are still very, very TBD. It's Jay Obernolte, who's from California, who's the head of the House AI caucus, I believe, and Lori Trahan from Massachusetts. There's potentially big implications there for healthcare as well. But yeah, it's still TBD, I guess, on that front. So I think, honestly, a lot of folks in the House and Senate still don't fully understand AI, which, again, goes back to that generational change comment that I made earlier. Um, and yeah, I would also add that, and Chris can probably allude to this a little bit more. There's a lot of emphasis on using AI to combat fraud, particularly in the administration of health and health insurance. I know there's a very controversial program at CMS to do that. I believe it's called Wiser, essentially a pilot program that's being implemented in a couple of states to use AI to help make certain CMS decisions. So that's getting some pushback, but more from Democrats, I think, than Republicans. So it'll be interesting to see where that's going. But yeah, oh, CMS, yeah, just as I was, talking about CMS, another thing I'm tracking that I think Chris Oates can also weigh in on the breakthrough coverage. So coverage for breakthrough devices. There was a major announcement a couple of weeks back, jointly by CMS and FDA, about a relatively narrow coverage pathway for certain FDA breakthrough designated devices. So it's pretty limited for, certain class two and class three devices. There's additional eligibility requirements, on the types of studies they must be enrolled with, and they need to be part of existing programs like TAP. So um, something I'm tracking. I don't think the full announcement of that has come out yet, but definitely something we're tracking for a lot of folks. And I know legislation is also moving, or not moving, but it's also there, but it's a little bit slow on the uptake. Chris, so it's anything on breakthrough coverage, again, given your Massachusetts position that folks are talking about?
Well, yes, something they're definitely looking at, and this is, I think, one of those things that um, if a company can make sure that their product fits in one of these categories when they come out, I think generally what I've seen, and you probably have seen it too, is there'll be a kind of a general vague announcement, and then a lot of people get excited, and then they'll get narrowed down as they actually get implemented. And some people might not realize that as they get narrowed, they actually kind of shift a little bit, and more people can be included in that. So I would say whenever you see an announcement like that, if your device or your company's products don't fit into that, don't give up entirely, because oftentimes by the time they get up, they are finalized, and usually by the time some members of Congress have called up people in various agencies and administrations, they've shifted enough so that folks in their districts might be included.
Definitely a more optimistic take than I personally would have, but always welcome optimism in this environment. Yeah, it still hasn't, like you alluded to, it hasn't been really published in the Federal Register yet, so it'll be interesting to see how that looks when it's finally put together. Um, why don't we talk about bigger picture at HHS? There's been a lot of changes, to put it mildly, on the leadership side, both at the department level as well as some of the agencies and sub department entities. What are you guys tracking? What's the most significant? What's playing out above all the other stuff that's in the news about all these changes?
Well, I'll start because I think what's really interesting is that Bill Cassidy lost his primary in Louisiana, and he was seen as he is a doctor, and he was seen as what was supposed to be the bulwark against Robert F. Kennedy Jr. During the confirmation process, and he didn't. And I remember we talked about this on a previous call that he was seeing like he could maybe only have the leverage for one moment to be in opposition. And I think, given that he lost his primary in part because of his opposition to the Trump administration at points, there's a question of is that a signal to the rest of the Senate that Maha is here to stay basically, and that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is not going to go anywhere for the rest of this administration, or is over the next 8 months or so, Bill Cassidy going to become basically a member of the opposition within Congress because he is not going anywhere anytime soon. And is he going to be a signal to the rest of the Senate that, if you are opposed to what Kennedy is doing, you might as well just oppose it because there's no good trying to go halfway. So we don't know, but I mean, this is one of those things that I'll be honest, I as a forecaster did not predict this to happen. I did not think Robert F. Kennedy was going to last a year. I thought that there was going to be he would get appointed. He in his confirmation process made all these promises that he wasn't going to go after various medical technologies, which he has. I thought that would have led to a big blow up or some scandal, and he would have had to resign. I think what we're seeing is relative to previous administrations, there's a lot more insulation against cabinet officials. Um, I mean, we haven't really had any big resignations. I mean, we had the Attorney General and the Department of the Secretary of Homeland Security. But I think you would have expected more given the people that are in these offices. So I think what I'm looking towards is, is it that Kennedy is really locking control of HHS, politically speaking, for the next 2 or 3 years? Or is it going to be that the Senate will try to push back over the next 8 months whenever they are opposed to him? And of course, does that change after the midterms? Because if we assume that Trump is a lame duck in 2027 and that Republicans are going to be competing for the presidential election, does someone try to take on that faction of the party? And if they do, does that mean that everyone else is going to be trying to defeat that faction? So I think there's just a lot of fluidity and uncertainty. And it's not as like what we thought in January of 2025 when there was a lot of folks, including me, saying was a group that was needed for the election, but is not needed for governing, and they're probably going to be discarded relatively quickly. I think it's been found to be much more durable, a part of that political coalition than I certainly thought.
Chris Cooper?
Yeah, I do think the spotlight will grow on RFK Jr. with the departures that you mentioned, Kristi Noem at Department of Homeland Security, Pam Bondi at Department of Justice, and even the former Secretary of Labor, who was coming under fire herself. So, with the attention no longer on those three individuals, I do think that again that spotlight will grow on RFK Jr. And you hit on Senator Cassidy, the Republican from Louisiana, who did provide a pivotal vote to confirm RFK as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. He chairs the Senate Help Committee, which has jurisdiction over HHS. So he will sort of, if he chooses to, given what happened with his reelection effort during the GOP primary last month, he could feel emboldened to criticize Secretary Kennedy even more sharply than he has in the past on things like vaccine policies and differing views on nominations and appointments at the department. I would guess that he will do so. Again, criticize him a little bit more sharply, but I don't think he'll sort of 180 his position at large and walk away completely from um, you know, administration priorities and things like that. I think I'm viewing his relationship, if he had any relationship at all, with RFK sort of separately from how he will approach governing in many other areas.
You guys missed the one I was most excited about, the FDA, which I know has been in particular state of chaos. I think only if, very shortly after announcing the rapid pathway, Marty McCreary resigned or was fired, however you'd like to term it. And I think a lot of his allies are also moving out or have moved out. I think the head of CDER, the drug authority under FDA, Tracy Beth Hoag, who had again some controversial views on subjects, let's say, was actually fired that same week. And then that follows, a lot of turnover on the biologics side, where Dr. Prasad resigned for the second time, amid a lot of controversies about, intervening in a lot of the agency's decision making for specific drugs and therapies. Um, any thoughts, Chris Oates, from the community again from Boston? I keep talking about Boston, like that's the only thing you can talk about, but it's so relevant here. Any thoughts from folks you're talking to about all this chaos at FDA? And I'm sure there's a lot, so whatever you can share.
No, I think it is, yeah, the concern is the unpredictability. And the concern is that this leads to delays and changes in priority and, the interventions from political appointees into the actual process. I think that is, that to me, I've gotten a lot of people who've said a lot of different stuff about the FDA right now. But I think the bigger thing is that they don't know if they start a process now, will that process be the one in 3 or 6 months that it is still in place, and does that mean that it's a kind of a waste of time? I think the other thing though is that there's no other option for many firms. That it's not like there's a lot of companies I've talked to who are saying, oh well, we'll just like decamp for Switzerland right now. I think those are long-term investment decisions about where to be, and it doesn't help the United States that there is this much chaos, but there is still that thought of, well, it's going to go away relatively soon. And so we don't want to put a multi-billion-dollar investment in a different country if we think that the FDA in a couple weeks might be different. Of course, it might not be different. So I think perhaps in the next um, in the next legislative session, if we do see that this kind of chaos continues, then you might start to see companies thinking, well, we have to start planning for the long term, which is not going to be based as much in the US as it is now. Then again, they might say, well, if Democrats win in 2029 or if a different Republican wins in 2028 and take over, maybe then the FDA goes back to normal. So I'm seeing a lot of concern, but not necessarily a lot of action in response to that concern because they are still relatively constrained.
Very true. I think the only thing I'll push back on that is the manufacturing side, particularly given a lot of those drug pricing deals that the Trump administration has been slowly moving out, actually pretty quickly moving out over the last few months. I know just a few weeks ago announced a big expansion to Trump RX, a lot of generics added on there, a lot of those companies that, did those individual deals with the administration. I forget how many there are. I think it's in the high teens, are committing billions and billions of dollars into manufacturing facilities here, which, regardless of, your other positions on issues, I think is definitely a good for the country, good for jobs. So, a lot of complicated dynamics at play. I haven't really heard about who might be, replacing some of these folks in a permanent capacity. I do know that the acting director, Kyle Diamantis, I believe his name is, I think he's in with a lot of Republican circles, particularly with the president's family. So he surprisingly, I think, has been a little bit better received than expected. A lot of folks are saying he's a bit more, collaborative and, willing to listen to career staff than Macri was, despite not having, any scientific or medical background. I don't know, Chris, Cooper, were you going to say something? I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, just I've seen the same thing that FDA employees have sort of described him as someone who does his homework before meetings and who listens to the experts in the room on the given topic. I would say he may be in that role for a while, just given the obstacles that the administration faces in both selecting a new commissioner and then also getting the person confirmed by the Senate. Obviously, there's limited days for the Senate where they're in session before the midterms, and they still need to or hope to move ahead on confirmations of Erica Schwartz, the CDC director nominee, and Nicole Saphier, the Surgeon General nominee. And again, just with the congressional calendar the way it is, because this is an election year, both chambers will virtually be back home in their states and districts for all of the month of August and all the month of October. That just, leaves not a whole lot of floor time to focus on any given nominee and also address things like reconciliation and other top administration and congressional priorities. So.
No, that's a good point. There's so little time. I know for a lot of lower level positions, I don't know the mechanism exactly, but they've been, essentially or approving all of them in one block. Is that, a possibility with some of these higher level positions? I know it's not ideal, but do you think that's also something that might come into play here?
I think it's a possibility, and we kind of we hinted on this a little bit with Senator Cassidy's relationship with RFK Jr. Again, Senator Cassidy serves as the chair of the committee that would need to approve a new commissioner to send their nomination to the full Senate for consideration. And depending on, again, how the senator chooses to pick and choose his battles in light of his reelection loss, depending on who the nominee is, he could take his time in reviewing their nomination before sending it up to the full Senate for consideration.
Yeah, it's all a power play at some point or the other. Um, Chris, so anything else to add? And if not, we can move to our wrap up.
Nope.
All right, we have about just under 5 minutes left. I'll keep this very open for your last thoughts. What other policy issue at the federal level, whether it's, a bill, an initiative, a potential agency action, are you guys tracking something that, you're particularly interested in that, we haven't discussed before that, a lot of folks on the call might also be interested in? Yeah, I'll leave it up to you guys. Anything you wanna discuss that we haven't talked about before.
Well, I'll just say I think the economic fallout of the Iran war is still not fully being felt. There are, if you talk to folks in the energy industry, they'll say that we're getting low on the inventories, global inventories that have been keeping the prices of oil. I mean, they're at $100 a barrel, but not at $200 or $300 a barrel. But those are running out. So one thing I'm looking towards is if the Strait of Hormuz does not open up in the next month, how bad does the global energy market get, and does that lead to a global recession? And if it does open up, how long do energy prices stay elevated? because that, I mean, is not exactly health policy, but that filters through to so many things because at your city level, that is higher fuel prices for your Department of Public Works. That means that, fewer teachers can get hired. At the state level, that is, less in tax revenue because people aren't able to, economic growth declines. So it's the sort of thing that is happening in the background, and it's not at crisis levels now, but it does mean that we may be going towards, for the next year, higher interest rates, higher inflation, and lower economic growth, and that filters down through so many different levels of government. So that is kind of at the federal level I'm paying attention to what's going on there, and whether the federal government the rest of it seems to be responding to potentially a different economic environment that we're going to have over the next 12 months.
Very true. Chris Cooper?
Yeah, I guess on the policy front, one of the things I'm tracking, back in, I think it was 2021, Congress established what's called the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology through the National Defense Authorization Act, to conduct a comprehensive review of emerging biotech's impact on national security, and also to provide recommendations to Congress to help preserve U.S. dominance in the field. And so, after a couple years, the commission did release its final report, which includes several recommended actions for the federal government to take to, again, try to outcompete adversaries like China and win the biotechnology race. Some of those recommendations are things like establishing a National Biotechnology Coordination Office, creating a biopharmaceutical manufacturing center of excellence, and creating, standards so U.S. biological data is ready for use in AI models. So there are several of the recommendations that have been introduced as legislation in Congress, and I'm tracking, which of those recommendations are going to be, able to move through Congress in the remaining months of the 119th Congress, and whether some of those recommendations get wrapped up into what's considered must-pass legislation, like the National Defense Authorization Act or the NDAA. The NDAA process is being kicked off in both chambers this week and next week. Just at a high level, the NDAA, in addition to including some of those biotech provisions that I alluded to, also, mainly authorizes new defense programs, procurement, and R&D activities. And Congress has, I mentioned it was must pass. Congress has enacted an NDAA for every fiscal year, I think, dating back to the 1960s. So I expect Congress to continue to make progress on the FY27 NDAA for the next few weeks and months. So I'll be tracking, how that's progressing, and whether we're on pace to get that done by the end of the calendar year.
Yeah, it's a great point. I know biotech is another area where, we're super concerned about falling behind with China, and I think there's some sectors where they've already, moved past us. So it's very heartening to see there's a lot of, measures in that NSCB report that are at least, getting introduced and starting to get some traction. So something of interest to a lot of us here on this call. Well, I think we are actually now at the top of the hour, just about a minute under. So we are going to have to wrap. Just want to thank all of you for dialing into this edition of What's Happening in Washington. There will be our next session will be announced soon. It'll be again in the next quarter. And we will send this recording out to all participants. So if you missed a bit of it, don't worry, we'll send it out. And with that, thank you again so much for dialing in. Really appreciate you coming on and listening to us share our insights. We'll see you in a couple of months. All right, bye now.
Take care.
Thank you very much.